Clara Wynne was once abandoned for being too small, but fate had a different plan for her. It was early spring, 1878, in Dry Creek, New Mexico, and the sun had barely risen over the dusty, weather-beaten town when she stepped into the general store. Her boots were scuffed from a long journey. Her hat sat too large on her head, and a short hoe awkwardly poked out from the bundle strapped to her back. At just 4 feet 7 inches, though she'd always say 4 feet 6 inches and a half, Clara barely came up to the store counter, but her gaze held steady, unwavering. Inside, the murmur of voices faded to silence as she entered. A woman by the barrels leaned over to whisper, "She's no bigger than a house cat." Another voice snorted, "And half as useful." Clara didn't flinch. She stepped forward, placing her items on the counter: a sack of corn seed, a folded canvas, a bundle of kindling, and the hoe. Mr. Barlow, the storekeeper, peered at her from behind his spectacles, raising an eyebrow. Well, if it ain't Miss Wind, what's this spring planting?" He picked up the hoe and twirled it mockingly. Planning to dig graves for field mice or bury sparrows for practice? Laughter rippled through the store, but Clara held his gaze, her voice steady. "I'm planting corn on my land." Barlow grunted as he weighed the sack of seed. "That rocky patch up north? Not even cactus will grow there." Clara's response was unwavering. "Then I'll grow something they don't expect." Barlow chuckled and dumped the hoe on the counter, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This tool weighs half of what you do." Clara opened her coin purse, counting out every last cent she had, and without a word, handed it to him. She took her sack, the hoe, and her dignity, ignoring the laughter that followed her as she walked out the door. The sun was still climbing as she crossed the wooden sidewalk, the bundle heavy on her back. But just as she moved toward the edge of town, a shadow stepped into her path. Thomas Keene. His hat sat low on his brow, and his polished boots gleamed like a sheriff's. He was the son of the Hargrove family, the same ones who had once taken her in as a charity case, only to abandon her on the New Mexico border when sickness came and she became too small to be useful. Well, look who crawled out of the dirt," Thomas drawled, arms folded across his chest. "Clara Wynne. Little Clara, did we leave you behind somewhere?" Clara tried to step past him, but he blocked her, his grin widening. "I hear you've claimed land. Tell me, are you growing tumbleweeds or just trying to get eaten by coyotes?" "I've got work to do," Clara muttered, attempting to step around him. But Thomas yanked the sack from her grip, and the hoe clattered to the ground. Seed spilled across the dusty street. "Oops," Thomas said, his voice dripping with mockery as Clara lunged to retrieve her things. But he nudged her aside with his boot, stepping back and grinning. "This isn't a place for dolls, Clara. You'll be dead or married to some outlaw before the first frost." His laughter hung in the air like the dry dust, but before Clara could respond, the world seemed to shift. From the ridge behind the store, a shadow rose, silent, tall, and lean. Gray Wolf. He didn't say a word at first, just stepped forward, towering over both Clara and Thomas. His hair was braided, a carved necklace resting against his bare chest. His eyes were dark, unwavering, and locked onto Clara's spilled sack. Thomas froze, his grin fading. Gray Wolf stooped, lifting the hoe with one hand and handing it to Clara. He then crouched, carefully scooping the scattered corn back into the torn sack, as if it were gold dust. Once he had finished, he stood tall, his voice low, but steady as gravel. "The earth does not care how small you are." Thomas took a step back, clearly unnerved. Gray Wolf didn't look at him again. He turned to Clara and held out the sack. She took it, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. He didn't respond, but his silence felt like a message of its own. Instead, he knelt again, pulling something from his belt pouch and placing it gently by her feet, a single eagle feather bound with a strip of leather. Without a word, he turned and began to walk back toward the ridge, his steps quiet as mist over the rocks. Clara stood still for a moment, her hands trembling as she picked up the feather. She didn't look back at Thomas, just adjusted the sack and lifted the hoe over her shoulder. With each step she took, the laughter from the store faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of her own breathing, steady and sure. She felt something shift within her, a weight against her chest. Not just a feather, but the first proof that she was seen. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was believed in. The wind howled through the cottonwoods at the edge of her claim, a reminder of the struggle ahead, but also the quiet promise that she was not alone. Clara Wynne, the girl once discarded, now stood tall, ready to carve her place into the land. Days later, her hands were raw from work, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She wrestled with a crooked fence post, her back aching under the hot desert sun. The wind pulled at her clothes, but she was used to it now, as if she had become part of the landscape, not just a speck in it. Her shelter, if it could be called that, was a lean-to made from warped boards and tarps, pitched at the edge of her 20-acre claim. Each night, the wind clawed through the cracks, and Clara would curl up under the quilt her mother had stitched long ago. It was the last piece of her family, a symbol of what had been lost, but also what she carried within her, a legacy of strength, even in the smallest of forms. Your little Clara, her mother used to say, wrapping that quilt around her small shoulders. But the wind lifts what it does not crush. And you, my girl, were made to fly. But Clara's flight was a slow, painful one, as she labored each day under the harsh conditions of the desert. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, she was interrupted again, this time by Grey Wolf. He appeared out of the dust, moving like a shadow with a bundle of logs on his shoulder. His presence, as always, was quiet but firm, and his offer was clear. "I will build you a cabin," he said, his eyes steady, unwavering. "Real walls, real roof, a place to survive, not just hide." Clara swallowed hard. "You want to build me a house?" she asked, a thread of disbelief in her voice. Grey Wolf nodded. "Yes." She looked back at her lean-to, the quilt drying on the line, her hand still cradling the gloves he had made for her, soft, worn deer hide. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She held it against her chest for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice tight with emotion. He didn't press further. "I will come when the moon is new," he said. "If you say yes, I bring tools." Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the ridge. His footsteps were soft, as the earth itself whispered his passing. Clara stood there for a long moment, feeling the air change. It was not just about survival anymore. There was something else in the air now, something more, a possibility. The next morning, the sound of a hatchet striking would reach Clara's ears. She wiped her brow, stepped back, and looked at the half-framed cabin rising in front of her. Real walls, real angles. Together, they worked in silence, the rhythm of their labor unspoken, but deeply understood. Grey Wolf showed Clara how to cut notches in the wood, how to set the beams so they interlocked, creating something stronger than either of them alone. There were no nails, just the wood, shaped and fit with precision. Later, as the sun began to dip low, Grey Wolf carved something into one of the beams. A sparrow, its wings tucked, its eyes alert. Clara couldn't help but stare, a lump rising in her throat. "For luck," he said, "the roof will know who lives beneath it." Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she traced the carving with her fingertips. "Thank you," she whispered. Grey Wolf only nodded. "You are the sparrow. Small does not mean weak. Sparrow flies when others sink." Clara stood still for a long moment, taking in his words, before she nodded. When he left, the wind didn't seem so harsh anymore. It was the beginning of something new, something real. Clara stepped down from the porch beam she had been sanding, the smooth pine now glinting in the midday sun. She shaded her eyes, squinting toward the horizon as a cloud of dust rose from the south, curling above the mesquite brush like smoke from some bad omen. 6 riders were coming, their horses kicking up the dry earth in a rhythmic pulse. At the front was Sheriff Beck, his gleaming badge catching the sunlight, his mustache stiff and pointed like a broom handle. Behind him, the Keene brothers, Amos Lang, and 3 other men she recognized only by the scowls on their faces. Grey Wolf stood beside the woodpile, splitting logs with a quiet, steady rhythm. He paused as the riders drew near, his axe still in hand, but lowered to his side. "Miss Wynne," Sheriff Beck called, stopping about 10 paces from the half-built cabin. "We need to talk." Clara's spine straightened as she walked to the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding, but her feet steady on the earth beneath her. "What is it, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice calm despite the rising tension. Beck glanced at Grey Wolf, then back at her, his eyes narrowing. "There's been a report of stolen horses from the Jenkins Ranch. 4 of them missing since last week. Witnesses say they saw a tall Indian riding through the southern trail. Matches this one's description." Clara's gaze didn't waver. "He's been here," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Every day, building my home." "Are you sure?" Beck pressed, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "I am," Clara said, her voice firm. "He's on my land. That cabin is being built on my claim. What he's done here, he's done with my permission." A murmur rippled through the group behind the sheriff, one man spitting on the ground in disgust. Beck didn't respond right away. He looked past Clara to Grey Wolf. "Step down from that axe, son. We don't want trouble." Grey Wolf met his gaze, unflinching and steady, but slowly set the axe down, its weight seeming to echo in the silence that followed. "You got any proof he took those horses?" Beck asked, his voice sharp. "Do you have any proof?" Clara shot back. "Or is it enough that he's Comanche and breathes?" Beck's jaw clenched, but Clara didn't back down. "He's on private land, Sheriff. If you want him off, you'll need a warrant." Amos Lang sneered. "She's bewitched, plain and simple. That savage is building shrines of devilry. That savage built me a home stronger than any man in this town ever offered," Clara snapped, her voice rising with surge of defiance. For a moment, silence settled over the clearing like dust, the weight of her words hanging in the air. But before anyone could respond, the sound of hooves echoed from the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Another rider approached, her presence unmistakable. Matilda Everdine, the widow of the town's founder, the most respected woman in Dry Creek, and someone whose word could silence a riot or start one. She pulled up beside Sheriff Beck and dismounted with a grace that only years of refinement could teach. "John," she greeted the sheriff with a nod before turning her gaze to Clara. "Gentlemen," she addressed the others behind Beck with a brief, dismissive glance. Before anyone could speak, she raised a hand, cutting off the rising tension. "Before we sling accusations," Matilda said crisply, "perhaps I should clarify something." She pulled a folded paper from her satchel and handed it to Beck. "This morning, the Jenkins Ranch recovered all 4 of their horses. They had broken loose during the last thunderstorm. Found them grazing by Willow Gulch. No signs of theft." Beck frowned, reading the paper, confusion flickering across his face. "Then what the hell is this about?" Amos growled, his voice full of frustration. Matilda's eyes turned to Amos, her gaze sharp. "This is about fear, Mr. Lang, and how quickly men forget themselves when faced with change." She turned to Clara then, her voice softening with understanding. "You built this home with your own hands." Clara didn't hesitate. "Not alone," she said, her eyes shifting to Grey Wolf. "But I helped." Matilda's gaze softened. "Well then," she said, turning back to Beck, "I see no crime here. Just construction." Beck let out a long sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "You sure about this, Matilda?" "As sure as I was when your mother gave me her wedding ring and said, 'Trust the girl who dares stand alone.'" The sheriff cleared his throat, then muttered an order under his breath. "All right then, we'll be on our way." The men turned their horses, their hooves kicking up dust as they rode off, but not before Beck gave Grey Wolf a long, hard look. "You stay clean, son." Grey Wolf didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. Once the dust settled and the riders had gone, Clara stood frozen, her breath shallow, her knees trembling beneath her. Grey Wolf stepped forward, his hand gently laying on her shoulder. Not to claim, not to warn, but to steady her. The warmth of his touch sank deep into her bones. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting that warmth wash over her. She had made it. She was still standing, still fighting. The morning after confrontation with Sheriff Beck, Clara woke to the sound of voices, many voices, murmuring in a current of purpose. She threw off her blanket, stepping outside beneath the makeshift canvas flap she had tied between 2 saplings. Her boots sank into the damp earth, and she froze. Half a dozen wagons were lined up along the rise above her plot, their wheels thick with red dust. Horses snorted and shifted in the morning chill, and men and women climbed down, some carrying baskets, others holding planks, crates, or tools over their shoulders. Children scampered behind them, already curious, already eager to help. Leading them was Matilda Everdine, her gray hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her boots defiant against the slope of the land. "Good morning, Miss Wynne," Matilda called out, her voice as firm as the earth beneath them. "We have a house to finish, do we not?" Clara stood in shock, speechless. Her hands, still smudged from the work of the previous day, clenched unconsciously at her sides. Behind her, Grey Wolf stepped from the half-built doorway, his axe still across his back. His dark eyes scanned the unexpected visitors, his posture unreadable. Matilda approached the edge of the cabin. "These folks," she said, gesturing with her gloved hand, "are not here to gawk or gossip. They're here to help, and to give." The Millers were the first to step forward, placing a warm but lovingly kept rocking chair on the porch and a small black cook stove beside the entryway. The Cooper brothers followed, their wagon stacked high with window glass, hinges, and tools. The Williams family brought preserves, smoked meat, and a heavy wool quilt that Clara instantly recognized as hand-stitched. More people arrived, each offering something: wood, nails, shingles, food, even a sack of coffee beans wrapped in brown paper. One by one, the settlers from Dry Creek gave what they could, some with labor, some with gifts, others just with quiet recognition of something they couldn't explain. Clara's throat tightened. She had prepared herself for solitude, for being laughed at, whispered about behind turned backs. But she hadn't prepared for this. She glanced sideways at Grey Wolf, his face still unreadable, but his stance softer now. His hands, usually so still, were open slightly at his sides, as though accepting this offering from people he had no reason to trust. And then they began. All morning, the valley echoed with the sound of tools and conversation. Clara moved among them, helping where she could, carrying shingles to the roof, smoothing mud and straw between logs, fetching nails with hands that had long since grown used to splinters. Grey Wolf worked beside the Coopers, hoisting beams with strength that made others fall silent. He carved joints, checked angles by eye alone, and cut notches so clean they slid together, without need for correction. His presence, once a source of suspicion, now grounded the work in something solid and lasting. By late afternoon, the roof was complete. Sunlight caught the new glass windows, casting ribbons of gold inside the single room. The stove was fitted, its chimney already curling a test line of smoke into the breeze. The doors hung straight, and the floor was swept clean. Clara stood in the center of the cabin, no, the house, and slowly turned. It was bigger than she had imagined, warmer, real. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Grey Wolf approached from the doorway, a small bundle cradled in his hands, wrapped in soft, aged oaken. "For you," he said simply. Clara stepped forward, untied the bundle, and opened the cloth. Inside was a silver bracelet, its stones set in turquoise, aged smooth by touch and time. Etched into the metal were small symbols, clouds, wind, and a bird mid-flight. It shimmered not with luxury, but with history. "It belonged to my wife," Grey Wolf said, his voice low, reverent.